We're live, California. California doing some interesting things again. Assembly Bill 1780 prohibits legacy admissions. Graham, as someone who's worked in the college and counseling space for a while, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot going on here in the context of California, in the context of the greater higher ed landscape in the US right now. I think even going back to some of the recent students for fair admissions decisions, when you look at the Harvard case and the end of race-based admissions that we've seen from the Supreme Court, I think this is an outgrowth of that. There's been a movement for greater equity in the higher ed admissions process. And so this is kind of an expected next step in that. And there have been movements like we've seen in California now against legacy and donor-based admissions in other places as well. But California is kind of on the forefront with this right now. So I think it's important to lay out what this means exactly. What is legacy admissions for those that don't know. So to kind of break it down, a legacy at a university is someone whose parents went to that institution, or that someone in generations before them has gone there. So there's a family connection there. They're not the first in their family to be applying to that institution, and that's something that we see at colleges everywhere. I mean, a lot of times we joke here in Texas, where I am, that students that are in Aggie families tend to be Aggies, and that's Texas A&M down the road for us. There's lots of colleges like that, whether they're ones that you joke about kind of the culture or drinking the Kool-Aid at a certain school. People tend to like the schools that their families have gone to, and so there have been a lot of efforts over the years to keep those ties going. But then kind of the negative side of that, where it's drawn the ire of a lot of people, and kind of been the target of Supreme Court cases like this, is where that becomes unfair in the admissions process, and isn't always creating decisions that are based on merit and the status of a student's academic transcripts and their activities and stuff that goes into the process, and sometimes creating what someone would consider an unfair advantage.
Yeah, that's
So
that's really
yeah,
interesting. You mentioned like the part of unfairness, like obviously, like I live in obviously California, Silicon Valley, right, where it's a pretty well-known fact that it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I wonder like if the logic is okay, we shouldn't be giving people an unfair advantage to university admissions. It should all be completely based on merit. Well, how far does that go, right? Because let's say, okay, my dad works at Google, and his friend, works at IBM, and I mean, it's very common, right? Like uncles refer their nephews, right? Friends refer their friends, and oftentimes those resumes get jumped over. Not oftentimes, all the time, right? Resumes get jumped to the top of the stack. No one looks at the algorithmic, cesspool of resumes, and it's, yeah, like somebody before me worked there, or somebody I know worked there, right? I don't necessarily think that people will consider that an unfair advantage, and that's kind of just people accept that that's just the way what the world works. It's not about what you know. Sometimes it's about who you know. But I respect it. I respect the equity movement in education, right? Because I think it's in some ways people think about it in a very different way. It's like, well, hold on, right? Like entire families, have poured their lives and investments into, equipping their students to get into certain universities. Or a lot of people also then put race into this equation, right? Obviously, and then they'll talk about how, legacy admissions, very much disproportionately favors, like, top 1% white, demographic, right? And they'll point out statistics at the Ivies about that. So I get it. I get it. And I'm not saying anyone's right and anyone's wrong, but I certainly don't think like this is like this is a place where absolutes is going to get anyone anywhere, like in an argument or debate. Like, even on the question of fairness, for instance, like, I think from a university standpoint, right, they're also worried about their finances, and, they want to make sure that, their alumni are satisfied and happy because, Harvard had a research that actually justified their use of legacy admissions many years ago. But it was very much like, okay, like we want our alumni to remain highly engaged, and hopefully, to continue to reinvest in our in our community, in our university. And they found that legacy admissions was a way to kind of keep their former legacies, right, and their children coming back and staying engaged in that community, because also, by the way, Harvard relies on our alumni disproportionately compared to some other schools for like their own admissions process, right, with the interview process and things like that. So there's a lot going on here. I don't think it's as black and white as most people think it is. But what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah. I mean, I agree from a few different angles. I mean, it's not just important for a university's financial health, which I think is a big factor here with talking about private universities where the legacy and donor admissions was already not part of the process, not allowed for public universities in California. But now bringing this into the private sector
Mm,
in higher ed, these are schools that really need those groups of people for their financial health to um, stay open and frankly like have more university spots for students available. And so that's one concern. I even think back to in my grad school, I did some research on what makes students successful when they're in college, and you can really break it down. There are a couple of different researchers that did this on goal commitment, which we talk to students a lot about their major that they're pursuing, making sure they're in the right spot. They've got that right combination of passions and talents going towards a goal. But the other factor with that is institutional commitment. And I think part of where you see this value on legacies over time has been that they're coming in with a high institutional commitment. They want to be successful at that school, and that has been a factor in the process. But there is real research that shows that has value. And so I think one of the places where you'll see that still be factored in, and what a lot of private universities already do, is they use demonstrated interest in their admissions process. And so we're getting rid of legacy being a direct part of the evaluation process for students. Demonstrated interest, I think, is still likely to be a factor at play here. Something we talk to students about when they're applying, but making sure that they're showing their their interest and commitment to a school through doing things like tours and interacting with college reps when they visit their high school, taking advantage of the optional steps that are out there in the application process, and really kind of going the extra mile. I think those are only going to become more important with this happening. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's something that we try to teach our families as well. Is in some ways, this isn't purely a meritocracy-based system already, right? And it never was. I mean, the people who have the resources to go visit, for instance, a university, right? Like, right, they have an edge when it comes to demonstrated interest or demonstrated intent, DI as we call it, right? So it's again, when you go back to the idea of fairness, I question that, right? I don't necessarily think that, oh, legacy, is getting rid of legacy fixes the whole question of fairness. In fact, I think it barely scratches the surface when you start factoring into this the more, in my opinion, the bigger picture here, which is economic inequity, and how a kid raised with fed with a silver spoon is has grown up with a vocabulary of 4,000 words versus a kid who wasn't grew up with a vocabulary bank of 100 words, right? I mean, measure that, right, in terms of the outcomes when it comes to SAT scores. Measure that when it comes to the kind of number of APs a student has taken. Measure that when it comes to just general aptitude, right, across the board, and measure that when it comes to college admissions, right? I don't think that getting rid of legacy is somehow going to just be this magic wand fix on all unfairness that happens. And I think, yeah, I think but it is a part of a longer term movement that I think we're seeing here, to try to make, I think, college admissions, in some ways fair. But you're touching on something, right? And we were talking about this a bit earlier, but admissions exceptions, right? I mean, I think it's important for people to understand that their legacy is just one small piece of a broader, criteria or broader selection, if you will, of admission exceptions. Why don't you go and tell, I guess, people about which ones that you feel like are, perhaps equally significant, if not more significant than legacy admissions.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's interesting. Legacy has been the most recent target for this, but there are lots of places that exceptions are made. And actually, if you dig into some of the numbers, legacies a lot of times are not one of the groups that's having the biggest exceptions made as far as differentials and academic standards. We see that in a number of other places. Some of the most common or most recognized would be student athletes at a number of schools. So there's lots of talent-based exceptions that are made, whether that's athletics. You also see it in other talent-based programs like music or with art portfolios. Um, and there are some great students that come through all of those avenues, but there also are some major exceptions made. I think of there are a couple of artists that I've worked with that have gone to schools like Carnegie Mellon, for example. One of the artists that I've worked with was a National Merit Scholar, absolutely would have been competitive either way. Another one was an exceptional artist, but would not have gotten in without the art piece. And there are talent-based exceptions there.
Mm, yeah.
Um, another group that has not caught the same sort of target as legacy admissions is faculty students. A lot of times the dependents of faculty at universities are having some pretty major exceptions made to get in there. Um, I, I think there are questions of equity all around that I think will continue to be examined and targeted. I'm not sure where this movement goes next.
Mm.
But I don't think we're done with the conversations that are happening around this.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, and I just thought of something too, and but I think it might take a little bit too long. Might get drag us into like another 60 minutes of conversation. But no, thanks a lot for your thoughts on legacy. I guess my final thought and semi question would be like, where do you see this all going really? What is the next target? And granted, this is just California. I think they joined a small collection of states that also already banned legacy, including I think it's Maryland, Virginia, Colorado, something like that.
Mhm.
Do you think that this is legit? Like, do you think people are actually fighting for fairness, or is there something else going on here, right? Because like, I remember, for instance, like recently looking into this about a couple months ago, and you know, disproportionately, for instance, like the Asian American community, right, is really, really backing. They really, really back the whole, campaign, right, against kind of race-based admissions, and if you really dig underneath that, you'll find out that it wasn't as pure as most people thought. And so I just wonder how much of this is just like outrage marketing, if you will, versus like true intention and true impact on fairness. Because I feel like you can't have a conversation about college admissions fairness without having a conversation about income inequity and wealth
Yeah,
inequity.
yeah,
And so I just find it kind of interesting. Like people, in fact, they touch on wealth inequity when they talk about legacy, but they don't talk about wealth inequity. They talk about just this concept of legacy admissions. It's as if like we, as a society, we've given up on solving wealth inequity, and we're just going after these like very, very small, convenient terms like legacy. So I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts? Where do you see this all going?
I wish I knew. There's different places it could go, and I think it depends who drives that conversation. I think you've got some people that are genuinely advocating for a more fair admissions process and a more just world that are involved in this. And I think you've got other groups that are really seeking out their own advantages
Hmm.
in this process that are trying
Yeah.
to find any way to help themselves. I I can see it going a number of different ways. I think it's entirely possible that you see some movements that take some of the recent decisions around race-based admissions and take that steps further and saying, hey, you can't give advantages to first generation students or other groups that universities have really targeted in light of some of those decisions to make sure they're keeping diversity on their campuses and helping students that need it. Um, I think a lot of people would hope that it doesn't go that direction and goes the other way, that we continue to find ways to help students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to have more equal footing in this process. But to your point, I think a lot of the advocacy has to go before you even get to the point of applying to higher ed to make up some of those differences, right? So um,
Yeah.
lots of work to be done in that space. I think there's lots of really smart people that are needed to come in and see how do we make a more just society, more opportunities for students that need it. I think the reality from this decision is I don't expect a ton of real change, even if legacy and donor status is taken out of it. I think most of your private universities are going to find ways to skirt around that under
Mm, yeah.
the guise of demonstrated interest, like we talked about. I think things like mission fit that can be used, especially with universities with religious affiliations, can be in there. So there's lots of ways that some of these recent rulings may not have as big of an impact as some think, but it'll be interesting to keep up with and make sure that we're coaching students along the way.
Yeah, and my last thought is actually a book recommendation. It's written by when I first started this journey in college admissions and helping kids kind of find their way. I read this book at the time by, if I'm not mistaken, by the head of NACAC and WACAC, and it's called "Creating a Class" by Mitchell Stevens.
Hmm.
And so, if anybody wants to read up on, what it really means to really kind of like fight for equity in college admissions, I strongly recommend reading that book, as opposed to just chest thumping about this recent signing ban on legacy admissions. I think again, it all starts with just simple wealth and wealth and equity. And so, yeah, read the book "Creating a Class" if you haven't read it before. It's a good one. But thanks a lot, Graham. Appreciate your time today, and yeah, always look forward to next time.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
Cool. See you.